Hello and welcome to this last session of the 20th anniversary Winterset and Summer Literary Festival. I'm Noreen Golfman, I'm chair of the festival board, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are here in person at the Beaches Arts and Heritage Center in Eastport, and all of you who are watching and listening virtually from afar. The Winterset and Summer Literary Festival respectfully acknowledges the territory of the Eastport Peninsula on which we are gathering as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We're very fortunate to have with us today two incredibly knowledgeable people, writers, both well known to readers in Newfoundland and Labrador and well beyond. Bert Riggs and Linden MacIntyre. Bert is a retired archivist from Memorial University. He's a member of the Winterset and Summer Literary Festival Board. He's a man of many parts who has contributed and continues to contribute to our knowledge of the history of this special place in countless ways. He is here in conversation with well-known journalist, CBC broadcaster, novelist, Linden MacIntyre. We're delighted to welcome Linden back to the festival this year. We hope to see him in person, however, next time he publishes a nonfiction book or a novel, whatever he's up to, because Linden always has such interesting stuff to tell us. Both men were born in the same region of Newfoundland around the Burin Peninsula, of which each is right proud, as you will hear. They cover lots of material in this conversation, but for the most part, they're speaking of Linden's most recent nonfiction work called The Wake, The Deadly Legacy of a Newfoundland Tsunami. It's a very compelling read, and as you will soon hear, it is a compelling conversation they have about it. So here we go.
I'm Bert Riggs. I've been a part of Winterset from the beginning, and I have been in conversation with Linden MacIntyre, the author of The Wake, The Deadly Legacy of a Newfoundland Tsunami. My first question is one you've probably been asked many times. Why did you write this book, and how long did it take you?
Well, it took me decades. I grew up with the story, basically, but I didn't grow up with much of the meat of the story. I grew up with the fact that I'd been born there on the south coast, and that my father had worked in the mine there. But the most durable part of that family experience was that my mother had great friends there among the women. Mm-hmm. And growing up, when my father was around, my father was an itinerant hard rock miner. That's how he ended up there in the first place. He had been working on a project in St. John's, driving tunnels on the south side of the harbor during the war for munitions. And there was a bunch of Cape Bretoners. There's a whole culture of hard rock mining in Cape Breton. So he and several other of these guys heard about this mine down on the south coast that was the equivalent of military experience because it was a strategic mineral. So they went down there and went to work in St. Lawrence. So my parents, they talked about that. My father married my mother at that time. I was born a year later, and they had a happy time there. And so there was a lot of reminiscence when he was around. And but I always noticed that it was always about the women friends. And after my I mean, these were hard rock miners. They were all guys and men, and my father must have had friends, but it never really sort of mattered much until about mid-'80s. I was down there as a reporter, doing a story that had absolutely nothing to do with St. Lawrence or mining. And I went to see my godmother in St. Lawrence. And in the course of just chit chat, I said, "Whatever, your brother was my godfather." She was faithful in writing to me and stuff over the years, but I never heard from him. "Oh, my darling," she says, "your godfather's over in the cemetery there with his two brothers, and most of the men from that generation are over there." And that kind of like was the holy smokes moment when I eventually over the cemetery, and it was full of guys who died in the late 60s and mid 60s and late 50s and 70s. And of course, my father had died very suddenly in that period at the age of 50. So it just sort of stuck in my head. I was a journalist working full time for the CBC. but it never really left my head. One day, I was working on a book, a kind of a memoir for HarperCollins, and in the book, I had mentioned that I was born in Newfoundland, St. Lawrence. I was technically born in Buren, but that was just, my mother was nervous. And I was born in St. Lawrence, and the publisher editor, he says, geez, I thought you were a Cape Bretoner. And I said, well, I am a Cape Bretoner, but I was born in Newfoundland. That doesn't make me a Newfoundlander, but I was born there. Well, how did that happen? And I said, I was born because of a tsunami, just off of the top of my head. Well, you'll have to say more about that. So I said, look, 1929, there's a tsunami. There's a collapse of the fishery, which might or might not have had to do with the tsunami. Then there's an incredible poverty. Provinces, Newfoundland, the colony is going bankrupt. It was a country, I guess, going bankrupt. And Hotshot comes in and says, I want to start a hard rock mine. And he started a hard rock mine. My father went to work in the hard rock mine, which would never have probably got off the ground if it wasn't for the tsunami, which left everybody penniless and without options. That's how I was born, because of the tsunami. And he said, years went by, and he said one day, he says, that story you told me about the tsunami, I never heard about that. You should write a book about that. And I said, well, you know, I don't want to write a book just about the tsunami. I'd like to write a book about the whole context, at the beginning of which is this tsunami. And that will include the terrible tragedy of those South Coast communities, especially over the way of Lawn and St. Lawrence, the terrible tragedy that came out of that mining industry. And he said, fine, have a go at it. And I had to go at it. And that's what we're talking about today.
Hey, sounds good. No, I, like you, knew about this when I was growing up, and it was amazing. Chaps that I knew from inter-high school activities who had no fathers, whose fathers died as a result of having worked in the mine. So it struck home to me very, very effectively. And it resonated in a way that even if you're not there, you become part of it.
Well, family is such an enormous part of the culture and tradition, especially of the rural, the coastal parts of Newfoundland. And the greater tragedy, I mean, there were several hundred miners died unnecessarily because of this. But I think the greater tragedy is the phenomenon that you encountered in school, which is that these families suddenly had a hole in the middle of them.
Mm-hmm.
Continuity from one generation to the other was broken.
Yeah.
And that, you have to know a lot about the whole Newfoundland history and culture to understand what a trauma that was. Kids growing up without dads, wives growing up without husbands, people growing up without grandfathers. I mean, that makes for a huge lacuna in the history and in the community and everything else. It was just families got together, they expanded hugely, and they stayed together, generation after generation. There was no sort of like intergenerational conflict. I mean, there might have been some, but the generation gap didn't exist. And so this was an aspect of the whole tragedy that resonates now even. Kids grew up without granddads. Kids grew up with a family that was tormented by financial and emotional stresses that they weren't ready for.
And dictionaries that I've looked at have multiple meanings for the word wake, both as a verb and a noun. And they range from its association with the end of sleep, when we wake in the morning, with remembering, with having our memories awakened, with death, and with water, especially the sea and the tides. And all are encompassed in your narrative. Why did you select that particular title, The Wave, for this book?
I'm going to be honest here and say that the title came out of conversation with the publisher, editor, who after we talked a lot about this. He's not East Coast. He doesn't understand the significance of the wake as the ceremonial part of death that we are familiar with. But he threw this at me, and it just grabbed me. That's the perfect title. Now, the thing I don't like about nonfiction is the fact that you have to have what I call the colonoscopy.
Yes, the
You have
colonoscopy.
title and then the colon and then the revelation.
Hmm.
I don't know why that has to be, but it just seems to be part of the part of the discipline of writing nonfiction. But anyway, The Wake essentially said the whole thing for me.
Gustav Freitag, the German literary critic, in his book Forgive My German, Die Technik des Dramas, outlined a structure of a 5-act play which has become known as Freitags Pyramid. And he argues that the plot of the story contains 5 parts: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement. And that was one of the things that struck me as I was reading it, that I saw the tidal wave and the end of the fishery as the exposition or introduction. The rising action was the depression, the desperation, Walter Siebert, the establishment of the mines, the Pollux and Truxton disaster. The climax comes with the discovery of silicosis and black lung and other diseases. The falling action is government and corporate inaction. And then the denouement is the cost of living and the cost of dying. Did that happen naturally when you were writing, or did you consciously construct the book along the form of a 5-act tragedy? If not, why did you choose this structure?
Well, because it's the reality of the situation. And I mean, that was the easy part of writing this book, was that the structure of the book was sitting out there. It was actually kind of a prefab. I mean, like the story of the tsunami and the earthquake had been told. The story of the financial collapse and loss of democratic government in Newfoundland had definitely been told. The mining story had been told extensively, but to a smaller crowd. Rick Rennie from St. Lawrence
Yes.
got a history PhD from MUN. You probably know Rick.
I do.
And Rick wrote his PhD thesis on this, a massive 500-page tome that had every bit of detail about the labor management conflict and an awful lot of the political shenanigans in it. I mean, that was there. The Center for Newfoundland Studies and all the various MUN resources were extremely vital. But the part that I found to be the most fortuitous, I suppose, it goes back to another aspect of the Newfoundland culture, which is the storytelling tradition. Newfoundlanders tell stories about everything. Yeah. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise to me that a lot of Newfoundlanders that I'd never heard of, or nobody had probably ever heard of, told stories about the tsunami, the earthquake, and the rest of it. And that people had collected those stories. People had gone around to the senior citizens' places back in the 80s and the 90s while the old timers were still with us, and got them in their own voices to tell these stories. A couple of PhD, or a master's thesis had included some of these stories and some of these interviews. And well, the interesting thing about folk memory is that it doesn't like hang itself up on details and factuality. I mean, you'll get the story about the same incident from 2 different witnesses, and there's going to be all kinds of like nits to pick.
Yeah.
But at the end of exercise, what I was looking for was a sense of the human response to these catastrophes. Whether it was the tsunami, the earthquake, wasn't much. I mean, like whether it was the mining thing that unfolded. I wasn't going to get all skeptical just because one person saw the tsunami coming up 30 feet and others saw it coming up 90 feet, which it never did. But I mean, if you're standing there, you're not going to quibble about how high it went. It took away your village.
Yes.
It took away your livelihood. It doesn't matter if it went up 30 feet or 90 feet. It's the result, that the consequences of this thing that mattered to me. So it was absolutely fascinating to sit down and to read the written accounts of what people said, virtually always in their own voices, and to get the feeling of what it was like in November 1929 when it's a starry night where there's no wind, there's no nothing, people are out roaming around the village, anticipating a storm, but the storm isn't there yet. It's a nice night. People are playing cards with the neighbors. And all of a sudden, this thing happens. Somebody runs in the case of the Rennie family in Lord's Cove, somebody runs into the house where they're playing cards and says, come out and look. And they go out and look, and the harbor is empty. The water is gone. You can see the bottom. Boats are hanging on ropes. And so, what the hell is that? And then all of a sudden, the sea comes back. Now, you'll get like 5 or 6 different kind of narrative versions of this, but they all have the same sense of awe and horror. You know, and Pat Rennie sitting there and he says, that's my house down there. Mm-hmm. And my wife and kids are in it. Now, are those his exact words? That's what he thought, and that's what he said, something like that to somebody. And somebody heard him say something like that and put it down for all of history. The fact of the matter is, Pat Rennie's house went from where it had been out into the middle of the pond. And Patrick Rennie's wife, and I can't right off the top of it, I think 4 of his kids died in that house. It's a good background for what we're talking about, because all of a sudden the night was ugly, and by dawn there was a storm.
Yes.
An early winter storm coming through there, just to add insult to the misery that they were already suffering. Mm-hmm. So these are the kinds of things that I could only find from reading the memories and the words of the people who actually lived through it, survived it, and never in their entire lives forgot one tiny bit of it.
Powerful. In your research, what was the most startling thing you discovered?
The most startling thing I discovered about the tsunami end of the story was the response of the Squires government in 1929. Now, the Squires government was not distinguished for a whole lot of kind of concern with the outports and common people. They had bigger problems. But it was a very pleasant surprise to me that within, I mean, it took days for the news to get to St. John's. It only took hours once the news got there for them to have a ship loading up with relief supplies at the wharf in St. John's and ready to go. And we're 20 hours later they were pulling into Buren, I suppose, but they were pulling into the south coast to. I thought that was quite a remarkable response by a government that was pretty well flat at the time. And now Newfoundlanders in general, whether they were on the island or in the States or in Canada or at the time, they responded magnificently in the weeks after this disaster. But then there were so many other things that it kind of went off of the radar, and the people were left to kind of fend for themselves. And that's what Walter Siebert, the entrepreneur from New York, discovered when he was coming and going there, that these were people that felt totally abandoned, felt totally desperate on their, left on their own. And so when he came up with his scheme, look, I can save you, but you gotta give me some slack here. You gotta work without getting paid for a little while. Is that okay? They said, well, we're not getting paid anyway, except the dole. And so, yeah, what do you got in mind? So they wait. I mean, that was the second thing that was shocking to me. I'd been living with this story for most of my life, but I didn't realize how trusting these people on the South Coast were. The willingness to give the benefit of the doubt to this total stranger only because he sort of made a good impression on local people, and that they decided that they could trust him. The parish priest said, "Well, we'll trust this guy for as long as it takes and see what he's going to bring us." But the fact that these working people, these people who were fishermen all their lives and for generations, would agree to take picks and shovels and wheelbarrows and build a mine from the first shovelful of earth until they were down hundreds of feet, work without getting paid for quite a long time, work without safety equipment, work without any kind of health or safety regulation or oversight. The fact that they were prepared to put this much trust in a stranger, that shocked me too. Because this is totally foreign to the way we approach projects of this nature nowadays, where there's a lot more skepticism, a lot more self-interest, a lot more caution. So that was a big thing. Rick Rennie's thesis was a great gift when I discovered just how much work he had done about the inter-union squabbles and the labor management problems, and and the sort of the shocking denial and stonewalling that went on at the official levels, of how long people looked for every excuse to ignore what was in front of everybody's faces down in St. Lawrence lawn, all the way over to La Moline. It was undeniable down there, but everything from tuberculosis to World War II to cigarette smoke, I mean, everything was being used as an explanation for something that was obvious to anybody who cared to take a look. There was a geological survey done down there in the 40s that made comment on the high radioactivity in the area, in the rock. And that should have been a signal to somebody to take a closer look at the rock that the fluorspar was coming out of. But the priority was to go in the other direction. You don't look for confirmation of something that's going to put a lot of responsibility and weight on the public sector, and a lot of pressure on the mining companies. You're going to look for explanations other than the ones that bring liability and accountability with them. And that's what went on for decades. And by the time the reality was undeniable, it was too late. The mines were worked out, miners were dying or dead, and it was just a sort of tough time. They had as we all know, they had the Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission was outraged properly. But all the Royal Commission could do in the end was to try to correct some of the deficiencies in the compensation programs that were out there, and try to beef them up a little bit and make them a little bit more flexible and generous. They couldn't do anything for the guys in St. Cecilia's Cemetery, and they couldn't do anything for the guys that were in the hospitals in St. Lawrence and St. John's, just waiting for the end.
On page 87 of the book, you write, faced with an assault by nature, humanity has no alternative but to mobilize a unified response. This is when the better aspects of humanity prevail, when we must find within ourselves the qualities that God withheld from heartless Mother Nature, generosity and mercy. And we survive. If we succeed, we survive as individuals, as communities, as a species. I thought that was a rather profound and encapsulating comment on your part. How do you think it applies to the people of St. Lawrence and perhaps to the world in general?
It's a big question. And, and I think about that a lot nowadays when we're facing Armageddon in various shapes, whether it's a virus or whether it's global warming or whether it's annihilation and another war. We're facing all these dire possibilities, and the only comfort I find is that we have faced many, maybe not quite as dire, but many dire situations in the past, and have survived them mostly because when all is said and done, you hang together, or as I think Lincoln said, you hang separately. And most of us will choose to set aside all the venal, nasty aspects of our nature and respond to the better angels and work together and get through these things. I think the great misfortune of humanity is that once the storm has passed, once the crisis has passed, we tend to go back to the bad old instinctive ways of doing things, which are essentially undermined by ego and selfishness. But the better the better instincts will rise up as they did on the south coast of Newfoundland, and as is illustrated by the stories after the earthquake and in the midst of and after the mining disaster. It illustrates the power of a community that's motivated by desperation to pull together and help themselves when nobody else seems to be prepared to step up.
What made you angry?
Well, what made me angry was the transparent attempt to deny what was just in front of, when the cancer statistics started to climb up in the 50s, even before that, when the evidence was there that silicosis was a problem, and that if tuberculosis had anything to do with it, it was as a hybrid disease that was exacerbated by the silicosis. People were being cured of tuberculosis, even though it was a plague. But miners who had got tuberculosis were incurable. I mean, these were things that were known in the late 40s and the early 50s. And the thing that really got my attention was that when in 1960, it suddenly became no longer deniable when the union and the companies and the government people from federal government, government of St. John's got together in a room and they said, look, there's radioactivity. We have had a radioactivity problem over the years. We have had a silicosis problem over the years. It's got to be dealt with. And just to sort of make the point stronger, the miners' union pulled all the miners out of the mines. We will not work again until this has been sorted out. And at the end of the day, it took a month to install the fans, to drive the ventilation raises, to ventilate those mines so that the radioactivity levels were plummeting down to safe working levels. The dust was under control. In 30 days, approximately 30 days, it was safe enough for the miners to go back to work. I mean, you imagine if somebody had just grabbed the bull by the horns 25 years earlier and said, look, we have a ventilation problem. People knew that. We have a ventilation problem in these mines because right from the get-go, the priority was to get pay dirt out to make money off of these things. And that was everybody's priority because the miners weren't going to get paid until the company started to make money. So let's, and plus these were fishermen, these were not professional miners in the beginning. These were people who, this dust is something fierce. They didn't understand it was unnecessary. And when radiation became an issue, well, it's, fluorspar isn't radioactive, so it's got to be something else. 30 days of improved ventilation, we can't imagine what it would have prevented. I think that's enough to make anybody a little bit indignant. That an industrial problem that's staring you in the face, that's piling up the bodies, continues to be an inspiration for passing the buck. It continues to be an inspiration for looking for causes in other directions that aren't going to cost anybody anything or embarrass anybody. I mean, that is enough to make you think. Anyway, the long and the short of it was that by 1961, the mines were safe, relatively. But by 1961, the death toll was unstoppable. And the mines were pretty well worked out. And St. Lawrence and Lawn and Lord's Cove, all those communities were going to face another period of economic hardship that has only recently been relieved a little bit by some improvement in the fishing and by some new mining operators.
Mm-hmm. You used a statement by Hannah Arendt from her essay, Lying in Politics, as the closing epigram. And you've already commented on the importance of archives and record repositories in your research and on personal testimony. But further in that essay, Arendt writes, truthfulness has never been counted among the political virtues, and lies have been always regarded as justifiable tools in political dealings. Whoever reflects on these matters can only be surprised by how little attention has been paid in our traditional philosophical and political thought to their significance, on the one hand for the nature of action, and on the other for the nature of our ability to deny in thought and word whatever happens to be the case. This active, aggressive capability is clearly different from our passive susceptibility to falling prey to error, illusion, the distortions of memory, and to whatever else can be blamed for the failings of our sensual and mental apparatus. Granted, this was written in the late 1960s and was a reflection on the state of politics in the 20th century up to that time, but it could also be considered a reflection, I think, of what happened in St. Lawrence. Has the world changed?
No. And the only reason that quote, I read that whole essay.
Yeah.
And I was reading it not because of St. Lawrence, but because of the whole Trump era, because of what happened in 2016 and the sudden, I mean, it's sudden manifestation. Lies, as she said, lies have always been the currency of cynical politics. But you know, we've always had norms of civil behavior in which lies were considered by the norms to be abnormal, to be wrong, to be deviant. And then all of a sudden we enter a political era in which lies are common currency. Lies are okay. Lies are a legitimate means to an end defined by the liar. And millions of people, not just in the United States, millions of people around the world suddenly say, "Oh, that makes sense." And I knew that Hannah Arendt was the philosopher of truth, and had a clearer idea of not just what truth is. Nobody really has a grasp of that, but she knew what the consequences were of untruth. And so I suddenly realized that what applied to the Trump era is not exclusive and unique to that era. It has been in a low and in many ways clandestine way, part of politics and part of public behavior for a very, very long time. And what was different in the last few years was that it was almost celebrated, hopefully for a short period of time, but it's awfully hard, as my grandmother used to say, to take the milk out of the tea.
Yes.
The milk of untruth is now in the tea of politics.
Yes.
And we may be stuck with it for a very long time. And yes, to your point, St. Lawrence was one of those awful illustrations of what happens. It wasn't the blatant lie. It's hard to put your finger on blatant lying or sort of unapologetic lying there, but it was denial, which is another and more sort of traditional form of lying. The denial of what is apparent to the honest observer, and what is bullied by the contradictions of biased observers and interest groups. That is as bad as lying. And that ultimately was what exacerbated the situation in St. Lawrence and on the South Coast, and in that particular tragedy of what happened to the miners.
What was the most positive thing that you discovered about this whole project for you?
Well, this may sound trite, but I went to St. Lawrence a lot during the time that I worked on this. And the most positive thing that I can sort of take away, and it will be with me for the rest of my days, was just the spirit of those people on the South Coast of the Burin Peninsula. The sense of humor, the sense of music, the sense of history, the sense of outrage in many ways, but it was the spirit, I believe, and it survives there today. This is what I sent. That spirit survives today. And it has its origins in the spirit that enabled these people to stand up and put their communities back together again after the tsunami, and to stand up and grab hands and hold themselves together as their families were being devastated, by the diseases that came out of the mining industry. This was the spirit that enabled them to survive. And I have to say, it's evident today when you talk to the people, when you just get among them, and you get past the serious chatter about the awful incidents of their past, and you talk about now, and you suddenly see that they are undefeated by any of this, and that the communities, for all the hardship that they've been through and all the challenges that they face today, they still react with the same kind of character and integrity that got them through all those dark periods from the 30s right up to the end of the last century.
So are you glad you did this?
Well, I couldn't have not done it. I couldn't have not done it. I look back, my mother was alive when I started it, and she was creeping up to 100. So I really didn't expect her to read it at the end, but I wish she had, and she didn't. She didn't quite make it. And she was a good source. She lived through a piece of this action, and she knew the principles. And she unfortunately didn't survive to see the manuscript. And I really didn't expect her to, but in a way, the book is for her generation, not just Newfoundlanders and Cape Bretoners. It's for her generation of people who came through the First World War, who came through the Depression, who came through the Second World War, and who developed remarkable ability to laugh at things and to be constructive and creative when faced with destruction. And so, to me, the whole story of what happened down there it highlights our capacity. And I'm not an optimist. As a matter of fact, very few people think of me as even being realistic. I tend to be a pessimist, but this story did inspire me about the capacity of human nature to bounce back and to rise up to meet really difficult challenges. And I think it's an important instruction nowadays when the challenges are getting even more dire than they were back in the 20th century.
So what's the next literary challenge, writing challenge for you?
Well, I'm going to plug the new novel.
Okay, please do.
I have a new novel coming out in August, and it might even be laying around this festival. It's a novel that, at the center of it, it's one of the characters in the novel is dementia, and it's essentially about friendship, crime, and how friendship and lives, complicated lives, are suddenly knocked off the rails by dementia, and how people respond in their different ways to it. It deals with a potentially controversial notion of dementia as a place for people to disappear consciously. And anyway, that's out. It's called The Winter Wives, and I'm working on a nonfiction that I don't want to say a whole lot about, but it takes me back to the troubles in Ireland in the 1920s. The Irish War of Independence and the Civil War and what went on in those times.
Do you find it an easy thing to move from fiction to nonfiction writing?
There are those who might say I don't move much, that I can use fiction technique in the recreation of non-fictional situations, but I can also apply the disciplines and rigor that come. I was in journalism for 50 years, and you pick up some disciplines in that line of work, which I will apply to the writing of fiction, so that I try to be factual and I try to be particular about people's character and just about the environment in which things happen. So there's a I mean, it's all about a good story. some of the very best stories are built on human experience and factual circumstances. Where fiction is very strong is in thematic development. You can't get too caught up in analysis of theme and character, and when you're writing a story that's based on historical details. You can do that in fiction. So I like to sort of move a little bit back and forth between the two of them and introduce a little bit of the thematic interpretations and character analysis in a story that's based on fiction. And at the same time, to be a bit nitpicky in a story that is fiction, but drawn from real life experience.
I look forward to meeting you in person at Winterset in the middle of August. Thank you, Linden, very much for being such an easy person to talk to.
Thanks, Bert.
We hope you enjoyed all the sessions in this year's festival. Thanks to all the board members who volunteered all of their time and of course their interest to make this digital festival possible, to promote it, and to share their good humor and good work with me. Much thanks to our staff coordinator, Robert Hiscock, and to, of course, the wonderful Victoria Wells, our technical producer of this year's festival as well. Thank you, Vic, for all your good work. Thanks to all of you who love to read and who showed up for all these conversations. We sure hope we see you all in Eastport in 2022, so stay safe and happy reading.